Thank you all for coming out on a rainy school night. And thank you for that lovely introduction, Liz. You're one of my best friends, too.
It's all about me. It's all about me.
Actually, I have a remarkably large number of friends here in the room, which is lovely. It makes it easier to talk. I've been doing this a lot, or for a long time at any rate, and I still get terribly nervous. I just have learned not to show it so much. So there you go. So my intention is to talk for about 40 minutes. We'll see how that goes. And there will be a Q&A afterward, but it is a school night, and there are no penalty points for just getting out when the getting's good. And if the Q&A starts to drag on, you can just trickle out, and eventually we'll all go home. Yeah. I don't really remember the title of my talk, so I'll just deliver the one that I've prepared. Hi, Olga. And I have about 5 or 6 things that I want to say, and I believe that they all relate to each other. I was told long ago that my lecture style is pointillist. So welcome to my pointillist lecture style. We'll see if I'm able to make transitions and join things together that belong together. I believe everybody, parent, teacher, administrator, politician, everybody who ever had anything to do with children or has anything to do with children agrees that children need to be protected. In Waldorf schools, we may discuss protection and define protection and talk about protection in slightly different ways than somebody at a different school or with a different idea about childhood. But we could all agree that children come into the world relatively defenseless, that the world that we have helped to create creates a circumstance that circumstances from which children need to be protected until they're quite a bit older. There's physical danger. There's the possibility of becoming sexualized at too young an age, of becoming turned into just a consumer or a pawn in a political game, of developing cynicism and irony at too young an age, of being misled into a kind of understanding of the world as meaningless and giving rise to a certain kind of despair, or alternatively of being indoctrinated into a meaningful world and becoming a fanatic. These are all dangers that await children if we don't protect them. So they grow up and we protect them. And then just when they get to the age at which they become capable of physical reproduction, they begin to develop their own emotional lives. They're in a zone that I'm going to talk a little bit more about between the onset of puberty, not the finished development of puberty, but the onset of puberty and the maturation that comes with adolescence. The world that we've created, like a judo master, flips. And the world that has been saying, grow up too fast, grow up too fast, and we say, we're going to protect you, we're going to protect you. The world now says, when you're about 13 or 14 years old, it says, don't ever grow up again. Stay young, don't develop a forebrain, don't develop discernment and judgment, remain in this kind of semi-mature, malleable state in which we can continue to influence you, particularly unconsciously. And so our job as parents and as teachers becomes not a job of protection, but a job of liberation, right? Assisting maturation. And because, especially in the United States of America, especially in the we maybe now have even left, if you read articles, you may realize we maybe have left consumer capitalism behind and we now exist in a world of surveillance capitalism. Whether that really means anything or not, I'm not quite clear, but it's part of the conversation. In a world that doesn't want human beings to grow up, our job becomes more challenging, more interesting in a way, even than it was 100 years ago in 1920. Steiner talked a lot less about the assistance toward maturation and liberation that I think we have to consider in talking about, let's say teenagers when we talk about them today. I also think the United States of America is kind of an adolescent in the world, right? We have great ideals, the best, and we also act hypocritically and get called out on it by nations that are more ancient and in some ways more thoughtful, right? As we should. Teenagers are idealistic. Teenagers are alert to hypocrisy in everybody except themselves, right? And so there's a way in which being an adolescent in the adolescent civilization of the United States of America is particularly acute, right? It's an acute condition. My wife calls it a mental illness, but she doesn't work with adolescents beyond, having raised two. My children are now 29 and 31, so they're presumably a little older than that. And so as we assist students or children from childhood through puberty into adolescence and into, let's say, late adolescence, we don't switch with the world. We don't give up all protection. We don't embrace all liberation. We have to pick and choose. We have to very carefully assess in what ways do our students still require protection, and in what ways can we allow them the kinds of choices and decisions and freedom that come with maturity, knowing they'll screw it up sometimes, right? So this period between, let's say, the beginning of puberty, which we know from research is significantly earlier than it was 100 years ago, and especially 200 years ago, and the delayed onset of adolescence that we promote by keeping students in school, keeping them away from meaningful work, allowing them to continue into college and then graduate school. I'm speaking for myself. Prolonging adolescence to the point where my dad just turned 80 in 2019, and in many ways he's still an adolescent. He's a lovely human being. If he were here, I could introduce you. But like many men of his generation, I don't think he ever really grew up. Nothing against other people who are approaching their 80s here. And so we have this incredible gap between puberty and adolescence, right? Even in the best of circumstances, there's a sort of widening between those things, an earlier puberty and a later adolescence than there was historically at any previous time. And we get to address that. Betty Staley, in a book she just put out called Tending the Spark or something like that, calls that gap a vulnerability gap. And I think that's a great phrase to use to describe it. Because she has dealt professionally mostly with, not only, but mostly with middle schoolers, she defines it as sort of age 11 to about age 14. I deal mostly with high school students when I'm not teaching adults, and I would say that the vulnerability gap exists from the onset of puberty through high school graduation. By 11th and 12th grade, many students are beginning to move sort of beautifully and often, I hope, swiftly past it, but it extends at least through the first couple of years of high school, this idea of a vulnerability gap. So, to talk about this, oh, I see. It's a fancier one than I'm used to. I just want to draw a simple picture that I can talk about for a few minutes of how I have come to think of the circumstance that I've just laid out for you. This growth through puberty toward adolescence, and the need for protection while introducing appropriate liberation and maturation. So the first curve is very clearly the curve of your physical growth. By the age of 18 or 22 or something like that, you're as tall as you're going to get. Now, Mr. Madsen knew me when I was 80 pounds lighter, but I'm not talking about that. And so, yes, there are fits and starts, there are growth spurts and so on, but very generalized, there is your physical growth. And your physical growth is limited by genetic inheritance and the constraints of the physical world. Right? Right. There's the growth of your consciousness, or your intellect, or your spirit, insofar as it is able to make use of your body, you could say. There's a sense in which your spirit, according to Steiner, is eternal and can't sort of be touched by education. Right? We can educate a student's soul, but not really the spirit. But the spirit still has to incarnate, so to speak. Right? It has to make use of the body, and it can only do that gradually over time. And I hesitate to use the word energy because so many people mean so many different things by it, but I'm going to use it anyway. And so you say, initially, much of your energy goes into your physical growth, and then that gradually relinquishes its hold on you, right? And it's because most of your energy, however you conceive that as going into your physical growth, relatively little is available for your intellectual growth or the growth of your consciousness, or however you want to conceive that. But as your physical growth comes to a conclusion, the growth of your consciousness or your intellect or your spirit can increase unbounded by physical constraints. The sky's the limit. I showed this on a dinner table napkin to a friend of mine who's a psychotherapist, and he said, this is my whole practice. Meeting people who have fallen away from the growth of their spirit, or the growth of their intellect, or the growth of their consciousness. I don't mean intellect in a narrow sense like learning programming. I mean it in the broadest sense. And helping them back, right? But I'm concerned less with that and more with what's going on down here, because I'm a teacher and I deal with students who are growing. You could also say that this curve, it's an organic growth curve that's different from this organic growth curve, is the growth of an education. Right? At first, certainly up until children learn to walk and talk, which they pretty much do on their own, you don't really educate them at all. If you're like my mother-in-law, you can try to teach them their shapes and their colors and so on, but that was sort of out of her 1940s early childhood teacher training. It wasn't out of, deep understanding of children and education. As children become more and more capable and competent in the world, it's really important that their education accelerates. This is a curve of acceleration, right? Especially in areas in which they are sincerely interested in which they are sincerely interested. If you have a teenager who wants to be a chef, give them some knives and some instruction and stand back, right? Don't say, today we're going to cut carrots, tomorrow we'll do celery, the day after that we'll do onions, next week I'll teach you how to make a stock, right? It's too slow, it's too boring. It's not the way you and I would approach things that we're truly interested in. So if the best education mirrors a growth curve of acceleration, the worst education is lockstep, right? It's like building a pile of sand with a shovel, one shovelful at a time. It's linear. It accumulates, but it doesn't, and it gets somewhere, but its rate of change doesn't change, right? Reading a textbook, one paragraph at a time, one chapter at a time, right? 6th grade geography, 7th grade geography, 8th grade geography, I've memorized more countries, now what? Right? Now, the truth is, I don't think any human teacher in the world is so terrible that he or she only teaches in that sort of linear lockstep manner. And unfortunately, none of us, no matter how many Steiner lectures we've read and how many decades we've been teaching, is capable of keeping all of our students at all times on this beautiful accelerating curve, right? So the reality is messier and is somewhere in between. Good education according to Steiner's principles, in my view, ought to follow this curve. You might notice some things about it. At first, it lags behind the people who are building the pile of sand. But then it catches up and doesn't stop there and say, okay, now I've caught up, I'll continue at the same rate as you. It instantly surpasses it and continues accelerating, right? And it's really clear from reading Steiner, at any rate, that our goal should be for this to happen around ages 10 or 11, after what Steiner calls the 9-year change. He called it the 9-year change because he was German, and Germans put definite articles in front of everything, right? His first book about education is called The Education of the Child in the Light of Anthroposophy. So it's like 10 words and 3 of them are the. If it was an American book, we would call it Teaching Kids! Exclamation point. So through first, second, third grade, we believe it's okay in Waldorf schools. I would say we find it's okay in Waldorf schools, or we find it's okay in the education of children if they don't get on a too rigid, too rigorous path too quickly. Trusting that if we assist their proper growth, they'll get where they need to be. All right. I'm also interested in this point. Once your physical growth has stopped and your growth as a competent human being continues, when might that occur? I think that's roughly when we get them out of high school. And so you could say that this period is between roughly grades 5 and grade 12. And I know I think I'm here to talk mostly about high school, but I don't any longer conceive of my work as consisting simply of high school teaching. I think of it as addressing human beings roughly from puberty onward until they go off to university. And then a couple of them trickle back and become Waldorf teachers, and I get to see them again. Do you want to say more about that right now? Maybe not. Well, no, I do. Hi, come on in.
Sorry.
No problem. Here's the more I want to say about this. This is really for my teacher colleagues in the room. Parents, you have to plug your ears. What do they say? Earmuffs, like in old school. Pardon me. Somebody's seen the movie. I think in Waldorf schools, we've got this nailed down. Early childhood and grades 1, 2, and 3 are beautiful and amazing, and we just sort of do it in an astonishing way, and parents love it and send their kids and so on. This part, I think we have work to do. And I think we have work to do because I don't think we recognize ourselves what this acceleration actually entails. And I've talked probably ad nauseum to some of you about this idea that in 7th grade, Rudolf Steiner wanted the children in Germany reading Schiller. Schiller's Aesthetic Letters, Schiller's History of the 30 Years' War. You can get them on Gutenberg.org in English translation. They're challenging texts for adults. He didn't want 7th graders to read all of them, selections. Reading a selection of Schiller, of Schiller's Aesthetic Letters, is challenging. I've said before, I'll say tonight, I think a really good translation of that for English speakers, especially Americans, is Ralph Waldo Emerson. I think Emerson is very akin to Schiller in the way he thought about the world and the way he wrote about the world. And I think if we wait until high school to read Emerson with our students, we've missed years of their youthful idealism that we could have captured in a healthful way by introducing these ideas to them at a younger age. Steiner, after age 10, said it would be good to read Milton's Paradise Lost. I do not know of any Waldorf school anywhere that has attempted to read selections of Paradise Lost with 11-year-olds. It's almost beyond comprehension, because I think for more than 100 years, American schools in general have dumbed down the curriculum. And pardon me, but if you have the idea that your second graders in a Waldorf school should be somehow behind the second graders in a public school or in a conventional school, and the public school curriculum is dumbing itself down unconsciously, decade by decade, nobody's really in charge, and you're sort of always behind that, then instead of teaching a few letters, letting the children figure out the rest and have the alphabet done by Christmas time, as Steiner suggested, the alphabet stretches out like building a pile of sand with a shovel, 26 letters at a time, followed by 26 capitals. It's June, oh, we have better do X, Y, and Z. We have bogged down, right? So I just want to draw your attention to the extent that you accept my graphic representation and the concept of an education that accelerates in an organic way. I think beginning in roughly 4th grade, we have a lot of work to do to meet children this way so that they don't get bored in 5th and 6th grade and start looking for another school, right? And I don't think this means more homework, thicker textbooks, anything like that. I don't think it means matching schools that are cramming. I think it means having a standard, preparing for the children to meet it, and assisting them in meeting it, right? Have a goal in 7th grade to read Emerson. You got a lot of work to do in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, right? All right. That is all I want to say about that for now. If you've been a parent, or if you've worked in an early childhood, I guess it depends which kind of early childhood. I got it. You know that there's a thing called the terrible twos, right? Children learn the power of the word no, and they're preparing in a certain way for taking more of their own life power into their own hands, and for beginning the process that's going to take quite a long time, in some cases decades, to differentiate themselves from their parents. We've already mentioned the so-called 9-year change, which is another nodal point, potential crisis point. Friends of mine who teach in public schools say kids love school in 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade, and then in 4th grade they come back and they say, I hate my teacher, I have no friends, I don't want to go to school anymore, right? Has the school changed? Have the teachers changed? No, the children have changed, right? There's a potential crisis point there. Technically, it's not 2 and 9, it's 2 1/3 and 9 1/3 for those of you who wish to follow me in being annoyingly precise. If you take a 7-year period and divide it into thirds, it's 28 months, which is 2 1/3 years. So 2 1/3, 4 2/3, when you could start like kindergarten, age 7, age 9 1/3, age 11 2/3, which we're not going to talk about tonight, age 14, and age 16 1/3. And that's what I want to talk about, right? So terrible twos, you add 7 years, you get 9. Add 7 years to 9, you get 16. Anybody who's taught 10th graders knows it can be by far the most challenging year of high school, the most challenging year of life up to that point, a year when children can get in all kinds of really challenging trouble, right? It's very difficult to generalize about it because it's a crisis or a potential crisis of individuation. They're becoming themselves in a way that they weren't at age 9, and they certainly weren't at age 2. And it's hard to generalize about that. Some kids put on their Doc Martens and their black skinny jeans and their black motorcycle jacket and let their hair grow in front of their faces and dye their hair black and stomp around and don't make eye contact. Other kids take off all their clothes, wear fishnets on the outside of their underpants and call that a, school-appropriate dress, and show up skipping around in a way we have to talk to them like this, or I do anyway. And everything in between. Some kids implode, some kids explode. Some kids make it through just fine, but it's a potential crisis point, right? It kind of sits, just like the 9-year change sits just before this intersection. This is annoyingly precise as well, I apologize. that crisis point sits just before this crisis point. If we're not able to help the students mature and liberate themselves in a healthy way at age 16, they're not going to be able to soar the way we wish they would when they're 17 and 18, and leaving us for college, leaving us to become apprentice chefs. And one of my favorite students, who I actually had to throw out of school for stupid stuff he did, becoming a bladesmith at age 15. I have a chef's knife made by a 15-year-old. It's my favorite thing in the world. Right? You can buy chef's knives 8 inches long and 10 inches long, so I had to make me a 9-inch chef's knife. He made the steel himself, half a circular saw blade and a chunk of something that was lying around the shop that had the qualities he wanted, right? Astonishing. It's astonishing what kids can do if we allow them to and assist them in doing it, right? Even if you have to throw them out of school from time to time. I may have given away too much, because how many 16-year-old bladesmiths are out there? One of my avocations is finding quotations from Rudolf Steiner that do not sound like my preconceived ideas of what Rudolf Steiner sounded like. And so I would like to share one of those with you. I think it's pertinent. And because we're here at Green Meadow, I'm going to read the whole paragraph, which is a little challenging because it talks about angels and archangels and things like that. Do I explain angels and archangels before I read it? I think I do. For Rudolf Steiner, each of us is accompanied through life by an immaterial being. The concept of being for Steiner is a I'm going to say an intellectual concept. I know that's a little too dry, but our English word being is too corporeal, and I want to get away from that. We're accompanied through life by an existence, or in another place he uses the phrase set of powers, right? That is available to give us strength or to help us. But if we listen to it too carefully, we can get in trouble. That's partly what this is about. And when we work together with others, in a school community, in a business, in any joint human endeavor, formal, informal, doesn't matter, then we're no longer working just with our own individual angels, we're working with the next higher level, according to Steiner, which he calls the archangels. So it's a new set of powers, right? It's a new immaterial existence. And then here he doesn't even talk about anything higher, which is just fine with me. This is from lectures that Steiner gave before there was a Waldorf school. So you can't say, oh, he's talking about Waldorf education, because it didn't exist. But he is talking about teacher education, because he was concerned with, pardon me, I'm going to take a bit of a tangent. When I started research for my first book, I thought I would find a place where Steiner defines Waldorf education in a paragraph and quote him. And the more I looked, the less I found. Steiner did not talk about Waldorf education. Waldorf education is something that we have created over roughly the last 100 years. Steiner talked about how children grow and learn, how teachers can address them in a good and healthy way, and he wasn't concerned about private schools or alternative schools. He was concerned with the healthy development of human beings. And so here he is talking to some young teachers. It's possible that some of them wound up at the Waldorf school, but it's probable that most of them did not, right? And he's talking to them about angels. And he says, we should not allow teachers to teach before they have gained a concept of the selfishness that strives toward the nearest God, that is, toward the angel. So that's another way he describes your own individual angel. He calls it the nearest God, right? The immaterial existence, the set of powers closest to you is your angel, or it's the nearest God. Why does he say that? The selfishness that strives toward the nearest God. Well, your angel has work to do with you. And he's pointing out here, I think, that you can make a grave mistake which is that you can assume that what's true for you should be true for everyone. And think of the harm you could bring to the world if that was the way you approached it. What's meant for you alone, you turn around and inflict on everyone. Yikes, right? Then he goes on and he says, we should not allow teachers to teach before they have achieved an idea of those non-egotistical forces that determine human fate and exist spatially distributed over the earth, that is, of the nature of the archangels. I'm going to pass over that because I want to get to the crux of this for me. It says, nor should we allow them to teach before they have gained an idea of how the past and the future affect our culture, and how that undefined rebel of the future can save us. When I read that, the skin on my body stood up, or the hair on my body stood up. The undefined rebel of the future who can save us. Who are our students in Steiner's view? That's who. They are the undefined rebels of the future. When we define them, we stunt their growth. When we don't allow them to rebel meaningfully, right, we stunt their growth. So my next book is called Rebel with a Cause. Right? Not rebel without a cause, rebel with a cause. Rudolf Steiner very clearly was a rebel with a cause. And if we're going to teach our students or parent our students in ways in which they can be undefined rebels of the future and can save us, then we have to be undefined rebels ourselves, or strive to be undefined rebels. I don't know if that makes sense, but I hope it makes sense. One or two more things before I wrap up. One of them is, I'm going to talk about this in a way I haven't in the past. I've talked about the concepts very clear, or tried to talk about them very clearly, but I haven't connected them this way. And that is to think about, what are the tools you need as an undefined rebel? Right? What are the tools that will allow you to save us? I'll give you 3. You need creativity and insight, right? To solve problems, especially hugely challenging problems, you have to approach them creatively. I don't mean specifically artistically, although of course creativity is bound up in artistry, but it's also bound up in the production of new technology, in scientific insight, in virtually every human endeavor, right? How does novelty come into the world? It comes in through creative insight. Healthy relationships require creative insight, right? If you're a therapist or a husband, creative insight helps you be better at those things. I'll read the quote at the end. So creativity in the highest sense, right? Another tool that you need, or another arrow in your quiver, you could say, is you darn well better be an ethical or moral person. What good is your technological brilliance and insight and creativity if you don't employ it for ethical ends? And the ethical challenges of the world we live in are myriad. I think ethical questions in the end are relatively straightforward. I don't think they're hugely complex, but I think there are more of them than there maybe have been in the past, and especially in a pre-industrial past. And so if we wish to produce rebels with a cause, we should do what we can to ensure that they're moral and ethical human beings. Creative human beings and moral and ethical human beings. And then, to ensure that they can carry out their creative work in an ethical or moral manner, we should assist them in becoming inwardly free. And I had come up with these 3. I hadn't started talking about them as tools of rebellion, but I had come up with these sort of 3 key ideas, or 3 things that I really wished to sort of find in myself and assist in my students, to assist the development of in students. And I realized there had to be a relationship among them, and I couldn't quite grasp it. And then I came across this paragraph from the brilliant developmental psychologist Howard Gruber, whose life's work was studying Charles Darwin as a creative human being. And Gruber taught in China, he taught at Rutgers, he taught at Columbia, he worked at the Piaget Institute with Jean Piaget. In fact, he was briefly director after Piaget died. He worked with Jacques Vanesh. He and Vanesh have published The Essential Piaget. Gruber is a scientist, developmental psychologist of the highest order. He sadly died in 2008. And this paragraph, I think, sums it all up really clearly. Our conceptions of creativity and morality are intertwined in a number of ways. At once we see that the indispensable middle term between creativity and morality is freedom. For him, it's at once we see. For me, it was like years of struggle. We can hardly speak of a moral act if the actor has no choice. Creative work also requires inner freedom. Creative work must be in some ways kindred to the world. If not the world as it is now, then the world as it will or might be, the world of the future. It, meaning creative work, flows out of that world, the world of the future, and back into it. Thus, the creative person, to carry out the responsibility to self, the responsibility for inner integrity, must also in some way be responsive to the world. And so for Gruber, instantly, inner freedom stands between creativity and morality as the thing that unites them. And I just love that idea. I can stop there, or I can tell you one more thing. One more. It's brief. Gruber talks about responsibility. Responsibility to self, responsibility for inner integrity, and responsibility to the world, right? You may know the work of Joseph Weizenbaum, who was a computer scientist at MIT, an early pioneer in artificial intelligence, developed the program called ELIZA, right, named after Eliza Doolittle, because in Pygmalion and My Fair Lady, the idea was to take a lower class person and teach her to represent herself as an upper class person, and Weizenbaum, as a young person, thought it would be really cool if you could take a non-human computer and teach it to act like a human. So he named his program ELIZA. It's 29 kilobytes of memory, like less than a Microsoft Word page document. And you can download it for Mac or PC and play with it. It's cute and fun. And it terrified Weizenbaum because he created this program that was basically a kind of language-based series of recursive loops. So you turn it on, it says either what is your name or how are you today? And you say, I'm a bit tired. And it says, tell me more about being tired. Well, I didn't sleep well last night. Well, why didn't you sleep well last night? And it just goes on and on and on. And there's very clearly no psychotherapist there. There is just a 29 kilobyte program cycling through what it's asked to do. It was, I don't know, just Weizenbaum's early attempt to try to make computers act like human beings. We've come a lot further, but we haven't really broken out of the paradigm that he was involved with. What woke him up was that he found one of his employees using the computer program instead of seeing a real psychotherapist. And this person asked him to leave the office while they were interacting with the computer, revealing all kinds of troubling things about life to the computer and simply getting back what he had programmed in over the preceding weeks. People say he became a computer critic, and his response is, you can't criticize silicon, I'm a social critic, right? He's not criticizing the machine, he's criticizing human development and use of the machine. And in a brilliant book that he wrote in 1976 called Computer Power and Human Reason, I came across this paragraph. And this is, I don't know, this didn't make the hair on my arms stand up. This made me feel like rushing out the door and getting to work. So this is from Weizenbaum about responsibility. And then I'll stop. The salvation of the world depends only on the individual whose world it is. At least every individual must act as if the whole future of the world, of humanity itself, depends on him. Written in 76, non-inclusive language, apologies. Anything less is a shirking of responsibility and is itself a dehumanizing force, for anything less encourages the individual to look upon himself as a mere actor in a drama written by anonymous agents, as less than a whole human being. And that is the beginning of passivity and aimlessness. I just think that's a wonderful quotation about responsibility from a man who knew what he was talking about. And it's going to turn out to be a great way to end this talk. Thanks very much.